This is Eric from Wisdom Heart, and we're exploring astrology for awakening. This is our conversation where we look at the current world aspects, the planetary configurations, and we tune into them as archetypal structures that are inviting us in a particular way to enter more fully and more completely our awakening life. And what we're looking at today is Mercury in Virgo is opposition to Neptune in Pisces. And let's remember, Mercury and Neptune as planetary archetypes are, as all planetary archetypes, they're aspects, permutations, or frequencies of consciousness itself. The unconditioned radiance of consciousness modulates and is expressed through these particular archetypes. And Mercury is the frequency of consciousness that relates to conscious mind, to thought-based, linguistic, and discerning narratives by which we understand and construct our identities. So when typically we talk about the mind in everyday language, conventionally, we are invoking the mercurial archetype. And we remember that Mercury was called the messenger of the gods. So it's this capacity of consciousness to travel between heaven and earth, to communicate, to translate, and to transmit messages in either direction. Neptune, on the other hand, is quite a different state of being, quite a different frequency of consciousness. Neptune is the imaginal, the intuitive consciousness, the awareness that's attuned to and communing with transcendent realities. There's an oceanic quality to this consciousness of Neptune that dissolves boundaries and merges parts into oneness. It's a state of being that allows us to lose a discrete sense of selfhood and to reimagine and discover the vastness of unconditioned states of being. So these are very two different expressions of consciousness that right now are in this 180-degree or opposition aspect. Now, we've talked about it before. The term opposition is somewhat unfortunate in terms of its connotations. It's like opposing forces or like armies on either side of a battle. But really, this moment, it is a moment in an ongoing conversation, in an ongoing relationship between these two archetypes. That's a cyclical or maybe even a spiral-natured relationship that has these critical junctures, and one of which is this moment where they are in polarity and opposing each other so they can face each other fully and completely. This is just what happens every month on the moon, full moon, where the moon traveling around has that 180-degree opposition with the sun, and they face each other. And this facing is a moment of potential realization and of rebalancing or recalibrating the relationship between these two archetypes within our own soul. So this balancing is, the idea is this balancing is towards a more generative, a more life-giving and wisdom-bearing relationship between these archetypal energies in our own body-mind, in our own life. One of the unique aspects of this particular moment in time is that Mercury is in Virgo, which is its own abode, its home, one of its two homes. And Neptune is in Pisces, it's also at home. So they're both, in a sense, they're in positions of strength. They're in positions of fullness. And this adds a sacred kind of dimension to this opposition. Mercury in Virgo, it highlights the discernment faculty. And Mercury in Virgo is the mind that is on the search for insights and understandings, but not simply abstractions, understandings and insights that can be grounded and that can be applied, that can be utilized in daily life. And Neptune in Pisces, you know, the ocean, Neptune, the oceanic consciousness, it highlights that transcendent function. It highlights that capacity for unconditional faith in that which is not easily known directly, but can be felt intuitively. And so there's a rebalancing here. We can see already in the language, the applied wisdom on the one hand and the unconditional faith on the other hand. There's a natural polarity between these two orientations, and it's being highlighted now as the emissaries of those capacities, Mercury and Neptune, are staring each other in the face. Now, Mercury is obviously the faster moving of those two planets, and thus it comes around, it touches Neptune and cycles around every year. And the last time it touched Neptune at the conjunction point was in March 30th of this year. And now it's been traveling through one half of its cycle. It's been traveling through for roughly 2.5 months through its cycle. And so on this half of the cycle where it begins as a seed, when Mercury is touching Neptune in Pisces, the seed is a moment of inspiration. It's a moment of receiving some subtly felt message. It's a moment of seeing through our habitual patterns of thought and identity and glimpsing a possibility, a sacred possibility. It's subtle, it's unformed, it's evocative, it's profound and ineffable, but it's been received. If you look back in your life and you look back to that time just after the spring equinox, when perhaps there was an influx for you of insight related to your purpose, related to your spiritual life, related to the call, particularly associated with whatever house Pisces is associated with in your chart, in your own karmic agenda. So this first half of the cycle has been unfolding, and it's a process whereby Mercury is trying to take that felt sense, that subtle intuition, that intimation of a vaster call, and beginning to, one, try to make some sense out of it, two, to remember it, to apply it, to explore it, and to stay in fidelity to it. And that's a challenge, because the very nature of that Neptunian Piscean imagery is transcendent of thought. So grounding it is a journey. And we've reached that critical point now in the cycle where it's time for us to recalibrate, to revisit, and to reflect upon how have I been incarnating that impulse, that awakening impulse, and how have I been losing the plot? So it's a balancing metaphor at this moment, and it's a very important balancing metaphor, and it relates again to the balancing of this impulse of transcendence with the impulse of application, with the desire to move beyond and to live in an unbounded way, with the need to incarnate and express specifically, that's the Virgo Mercury side of the house, that impulse in our daily activities. And Ken Wilber, the great spiritual philosopher, has a beautiful insight that can be applied to this, which he calls the PreTrans fallacy. It's where we confuse that which transcends our conventional mind for that which it precedes our conventional mind. We think about the mind and our capacity for rationality. There are stages of cognitive development that are pre-rational. And there are stages of cognitive development which are trans-rational. But experientially, it can be easy to confuse the two. Why? Because if the mind regresses into pre-conventional states of awareness, it does free itself from the confines of rationality, of language, of narrative self. It frees itself by regressing to a stage of awareness that is pre-rational, pre-linguistic, pre-reflective, trance-dancing. All kinds of rituals around the world are facilitate this regressive movement back into pre-rational states. And there's nothing wrong with those, but it's important not to confuse that with the trans-rational liberation, which also moves us beyond language, transcends language, transcends the narrative self, transcends rationality, but doesn't lose the capacity for discernment. That's the distinction. The pre-conventional states of mind don't yet have rationality and reflective consciousness developed. The trans-conventional states of mind expand the horizon of our awareness to include, but not be limited by, rationality. And so that's the challenge of this moment of the opposition. And the reflection is, have I been over-privileging? Have I been leaning in? Have I been avoiding the tension and the challenge of the incarnating of that spiritual possibility, and been hiding out, as it were, in states of bliss and states of oceanic enjoyment without doing the hard work of incarnating those insights, those felt senses, those intimations into the activity of my daily life? That would be following the regressive pre-conventional impulse, which Neptune certainly can invite us into, but that's not its higher invitation. Its higher invitation is to expand the horizon of awareness so that we can become truly the vehicles of that wisdom, that love that is beyond conventional understanding, and live it in our daily life. Now, in the Bhagavad Gita, there's several verses that illuminate and these challenges, and also illuminate the promise of this Mercury opposition Neptune aspect. And remember, the Gita is a dialogue, it's a conversation between Arjuna and Krishna. Now, Arjuna represents the individual, the conventional mind, the conditioned identity, and Krishna is the voice of the wisdom, heart consciousness, the transcendent presence, the divine awareness. So in a sense, not 100% accurate, but in the sense of this aspect that we're exploring, Arjuna is Mercury, the conventional mind. Krishna is Neptune, the invitation to transcendence. And Krishna, throughout the Gita, of course, is constantly inviting Arjuna to discover his deeper identity beyond the habits of mind, beyond the memories of personal history, beyond the cultural conditioning. And that's the invitation for us as well. in chapter 2 of the Gita, there is this oceanic metaphor. Krishna says, to the one who has attained the ultimate song, the teachings of the Vedas are like a pond that has been covered in a great flood. Such a being overflows with holy love. So he's saying here, he's teaching us that, that the call of our meditative spiritual practice, the call of this very aspect, is to allow the mind, Mercury, to tune into the ultimate song, which is the Neptunian melody that, when we listen to it, carries our heart mind beyond personal history, even beyond cultural history, into the divine silence, where all teachings originate and where all teachings dissolve. All teachings, which are all aspects of Mercury, the messenger of the gods, all of those wisdom insights, no matter how profound, ultimately have their source and their home in silence. And so the ultimate song is that invitation to see through even the most brilliant insight and to see to the radiance that gives it its brilliance. It's the invitation to dissolve even the most profound teaching back into the vastness of the ultimate song. The word, the silence, the origin. In Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, the very second chapter verse says, Chitta vritti nirodha. It's the stilling of the patternings of the mind. It's the stilling of all the conditioned patternings that allow us to fulfill this Mercury opposition Neptune, which is to see clearly, to receive completely the vision that transcends thought. When the mind stuff is stilled, when the chitta vritti, when the vrittis are silenced, when the patternings are at quiescent peace, then the self rests unto itself, and sees. So this is not an invitation to regression. It's not an invitation to some kind of infantilizing cocoon of self-protection. It's rather an invitation for us to expand the horizon of our awareness so that we can return to the marketplace. In the great Zen teachings of the bulls, the 10 bulls of awakening, the final stage is this return to the marketplace. And the marketplace is a Mercury symbol. It's to return to the land of Virgo, of work, of daily life, with that infusion of grace, of Neptunian bliss, so that we come back, as the Zen masters say, with gift-bestowing hands, with skillful means. So this is the being who overflows with holy love that the Gita is pointing us to. We overflow. We don't regress. We overflow and express that which is inexpressible to the everyday mind, but not to the embodied realization that allows us to become servants, Virgo, expressing and mastering the craft, Virgo, of embodying love in action. So that's the invitation of this aspect for us, and to see in our own life, where have I received the call to be the servant, to be the agent of that transcendent love? How have I been holding back? How I've been avoiding? And how can I more skillfully and wisely incarnate the transcendent in the activities of daily life.